I'm a bit annoyed at myself about making this recording now, because this recording is going to be somewhat speculative, but it didn't need to be speculative. It's only because I don't have my models drawn out in front of me that I can't really come to these sorts of conclusions, so I will speculate about them. But this kind of speculation is very tight, because in some sense it's going to be one of the variations that I speculate about. Um, so and in some sense, like, so I am going to say sort of vague metaphorical things, but in some sense, I have a very particular understanding of how that needs to sort of manifest. It's going to be in one of three ways or something like that. So yeah. So anyway, so what I'm going to be getting into now is on the heels of what I just spoke about, in terms of now having a much better model, perhaps, or a more refined picture of what self-actualization looks like. Um, Perhaps connected with operating theta in Scientology, and operating thetan in Scientology, perhaps connected to anyway to other schools of liberation, enlightenment, or whatever. But so anyway, the point here would be, I'm just going to re-emphasize something that I kind of mentioned in the long recording that this is on the heels of. This recording is on the heels of a long recording where I was talking about Evan's YouTube video, and I was just kind of responding to that, and that sort of clicked a whole lot of things for me to go into. So it was very inspirational. So let me just say that one of the things that I want to re-emphasize is this idea of repartitioning the four sides of the mind as part of the stabilization of Kegan stage 5, and also that that repartitioning really lines up with understanding, if you take my model of the four sides of the mind being parallel with Plato's divided line, and then you understand that the greater of the lesser of the greater, the third segment of the divided line, which is what I've obviously correlated with Kegan stage 3, the unconscious side of the mind, that is where principles lie. The first, and so that third segment of the divided line in the new partitioning that I have described in the end of the last recording, becomes in some sense the first place. It becomes the place of first things, the principia. So that lines up quite nicely. That the rationale segment of the divided line in my, perhaps I'll have the picture of the divided line in this recording. If I don't put it onto the last one, because I only kind of get into it later on. But anyway. So anyway, with that in mind, and then now with a new impetus to kind of remodel what's going on between metagram and metatype, in terms of how the unconscious side of the mind, because the unconscious side of the mind has within itself, within its own circuitry of the metagram circuitry, within which are parts and parcel of the field circuits, which have to be expressed in sort of field circuit nomenclature, that, and therefore you have to reduce yourself into a kind of sort of a commensurate sort of, the unconscious side of the mind, the karmic sort of interface between your false ego complex and the world, is almost like the embodied, actualized. In some sense, it's almost like the third side of the mind, Kegan stage 3, is like a synthesis of the superego and the subconscious synthesized together. That's an interesting kind of point to make. But then, as I said, in the new partition, it becomes the first place, so the place of principle, the principia. So, in some sense, that becomes the new ground floor. Karma becomes the anchor, becomes the kind of your feet on the ground of karma. The karma is the thing upon which everything else is operating above. So that's the kind of the parallel with the kind of the discerning spirit, that you see into what's going on with a spiritual gaze and a spiritual discerning. And you see the spiritual operation, and then you have I wanted to, I guess, talk again about the golden circuitry and the kind of and that weird kind of dichotomous issue here. But anyway, this is not the angle that I wanted to approach it from. Actually, I wanted to talk about reconceiving metagram circuitry, because I had some new ideas that this new kind of outline was sparking in my mind. Let me just find them again. Oh yes, so the mystery of the metagram metatype integration now, I think, will likely be one of three forms of integration. So the one way in which it's integrated is that the three subtypes of circuitry that correspond with sattva, rajas, and tamas, the three different types of converters between karmic fields, between the four karmic fields, in which there are, each field has six spins of charge within it. Um, Although, anyway, I don't want to get into talking about that, because I mean that is, there's a bigger story to tell about that. But anyway, that um, about those subcomponents of those fields. But and this is all an interesting sort of subtraction or extraction from the 17 model, because the elements of the karmic fields are 12 out of the 17 dimensions of psychological reality. So in some sense, the remaining five, the final five, are somewhat the final five are in some sense much too close to the awareness, the actual driving seat of consciousness, that they cannot be themselves objectified, because they are part of almost the substrate within which mental objects appear within their field of manipulation for, to be witnessed by the awareness of the awareness. So in some sense, the one is the one is the prime witness, and the other one is in some sense the expressive permutation of a record of the activity of that prime witness, or something like that. So there's a sense of spiritual um, uh, container of the soul, in some sense, um, between these two internal, and this is why, in some sense, it's important to have your own understanding, because if you don't have your own independent understanding, then that kind of distinction is somewhat codependent on some kind of external authority, um, and then some kind of strange invention of an objective truth, which is, in my mind, indistinguishable from the connotation and the implication of death, as I've defined it in the last recording, that death is the limitation of the cognition in some sense. So the question is that, like, from the false ego complex, now with and I've already described it, the re-emergence of the tree of life, the resuscitation of the tree of life, and in some sense the dis- the dissipation of the archetype corresponding to the false prophet, that you've placed the false prophet in the lake of fire, which was a very hard sort of thing to sort of synthesize out of, making sure that you have, in terms of the reformation of the super ego, which I went through in the last recording. So anyway, that the unconscious side of the mind, Kegan stage 3, see, the real question is, well, this is my real question, which is almost like a stupid question, because it doesn't really exist in the metagram theory, sorry, in the metatype theory, but it does exist in terms of how to reconcile metagram and metatype, because I don't actually know exactly how to reconcile metagram and metatype yet. So the issue why it's hard is because the sequence of metagram circuitry, the actual internal sequence to itself, takes the metagram out of sequence. It skips around. It goes back. It's one step forward, two steps back, three steps forward. And they all follow their own pattern depending on the subtype. So Rajas goes from the death to the sin, and then, I mean, I won't mention all the things because I don't have that in front of me, but essentially I know the first two steps of each of them. So for example, the first two steps, and obviously they're always steps, right? They're always 6 steps. So relative to the hangover of the metatype, there is this understanding that there is this kind of consecutive flow that is natural to metatype, and then metagram is mixing that up. So I've already kind of posited that the reason why you have this problematic gateway from the subconscious to the unconscious, and from the unconscious to the ego, the reason why you have those gateways problems is because you have the hangover of the flow of metatype, and then the disquieting disarray of sequential madness that metagram seems to have its own internal sequential flow, which does not conform to metatype. And in some sense, then that creates waves of discontinuity in terms of how, and in some sense, sattva has the nicest time, because in some sense, sattva doesn't have a sequentialism in it. It has a dissequence like all the other discontinuity, but its discontinuity is actually impinging on its own sanity more than projecting onto other people. In some sense, there's something about sattva in which it is ordered within its own disordering of metagram circuitry. It is disordered in such a way that it bears the brunt, it bears the cost of its own sequence more so than the other types will have essentially a tendency to inculcate it into their gateway filters. So other people will kind of project onto their bookends, onto the 2.5, 3.5 things that I've already spoken about, the gateway filters. Whereas sattva will have less of a tendency, but it won't still have no tendency whatsoever. But anyway, I've said this all before. What is something novel here for me to think about is the idea is which of the metagram components, subcomponents of the, because it always has 6 components. It has 6 components. Now, according to its own internal disorder, there is already an internal impingement and an internal strain that is caused by, like, let's say, the kind of the I can only think of a vague metaphors, but like in some sense the actual knock-on effect of the this then this then this then this creates a kind of an internal processionary rhythm, a particular melody of disharmony in some sense. And so it's like, this is like when your child is playing rock music very, very loudly because they're trying to drown out the melodies of other people, and they want to find their own in their own discordance. They're trying to meditate on their own unconscious circuitry or whatever. They're trying to ground themselves in some sense. They're trying to find their dominant function within their unconscious, and then also the parent function. Obviously, now this is the thing: is that the parent function and the trial function and the sin function. So generally, the thing that would be interesting to know is that depending on the particular disorder of the particular subtype, you see, this is the problem, because it is fundamentally confused. It is fundamentally 2 things in 1 thing. So in some sense, does the internal sequence of the metagram itself which is a disordering of metatype, does it fall under the circus tent of the metatype? And in some sense, is the metatype still functioning in its normal sequence, but through the appendage, through the content of the metagram, which is occluding the metatype natural sequence? So is it like a subversion or a kind of projection of metagram on top of metatype? In which case, then there's always going to be 2 points of stress and weakness. In some sense, the last 2 stages are naturally the weakest in every type, the inferior function and the sin. because especially when you reach the sin, then you know that the inferior function is always going to lead on to a kind of terminal failure, and essentially, and particularly, it's going to devalue your child function. So essentially, the lust, the second link in the chain, is going to be particularly set upon and violently sort of invalidated by the sin, especially, but also the trial, as a kind of harbinger of the sin. And so, because the inferior function, the trial, starts to instinctively, the dominant function, or the parent function, is actually more the parent function that's in the control center, starts to say, look, I'm the parent function, and I'm the one who's handing over the material that allows the inferior function and the sin to invalidate the 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 child function, and the parent function cares about um, the child function. This is hard for me to say because it might care about both, especially with the kinds of disorders that exist within metagram. Because in some sense, there are going to be two inferior functions and two sins and two child functions, because there's going to be, let's say, the metatype substrate that's occluded by the metagram circuitry, and then the metagram circuitry itself is a smattering of a disordered recombobulation and reconfiguration of metagram. It's a reheating of metatype. Metagram is almost putting metatype through a blender and then getting out these very fixed correlations within metatype. So it's like you're actually, you don't know how to deal with metatype as a metagram circuit. So what you do is you weld it together. You say, okay, well, these two things might as well be conflated. Might as well be that the one will have a direct impingement on the other one. So, like, I'm very conscious of this because when I was developing my false ego complex, I already had enough of a model of cognition that I could somewhat be aware of what it was that I was doing. But other people would do this in some sense. They are. It's like, for example, you have a pocket watch, and then it falls out of your pocket, and all the little things inside of it are sort of spill out, and then so you've got all these subcomponents, and then you're trying to fix it yourself, but like it doesn't, you can't put it back together again, and maybe some of the things are cracked from your current perspective, and you don't know how to fix these things. So you kind of you add a bit of crazy glue, and in some sense the crazy glue is the metagram, and you end up gluing together things that were never originally together, but you think, oh well, it'll work easier when I glue these things together. And I mean, I was doing this even I think you start tentatively doing this even from, I remember doing this from the age of even 8 years old, perhaps, or I was even contemplating doing it, or for some reason I was contemplating doing it and I was holding myself off from doing it because I could see that essentially that would create problems. And I remember getting into shouting matches with people because they had already grown up into their unconsciousness, and I would essentially be able to dispel their unconsciousness, and then their parents would get angry at me that I was sort of like bringing their children back into mastery of their subconscious rather than growing up into juveniles. And in some sense, I was quite able to explain to them how essentially their whole transition from their subconscious to their unconscious was essentially by the propitiation of almost the sadistic treatment of their parents. It was always based in trauma. It was based in inclining themselves towards and something towards the adult game of, in some sense, adulting, as they even call it, adulting. Um, in the modern vernacular, even they call it adulting. That in some sense you are, but in some sense it doesn't. It's to the extent to which adults still themselves are very prone to their own Kegan stage 3, and they never made it into Kegan stage 4 stably, or they have a Kegan stage 4.5, which in some sense, they believe that they're adults, but in some sense it's all based on a kind of fractious replay and drama and projection of drama and narrative that all comes in some sense. Their unconscious side of the mind is completely flagrantly being spilled out onto other people. Um, and in some sense, what a lot of children will do is they will adopt metagram circuitry that essentially helps shield them or deflect the kind of spillage that they're getting from their juvenile parents in some sense. And to a large extent, I think that might also be largely premature. That a lot of people will enter their unconscious side of the mind in a premature way, and they will still have a lot of, essentially, they'll have a dirty 2.5 narcissistic gateway filter will kind of be very dirty and gummed up with a kind of naive narcissism because they never perfected the vanity, they never perfected the dominant function in their subconscious. So they grew up too quickly in some sense. And in some sense, that is very much, I think, close to the concept in narcissism that Sam Buckman talks about as the false self. That the false self is essentially the hollow unconscious, which is essentially just a puppet figure, a puppet of the subconscious. So in some sense, you have a faux unconscious because you don't have any confidence in your unconscious because your own subconscious never grew up. So you never had any, essentially, you never had the healthy narcissism of exploring the unconscious with a kind of, with the requisite safety net or something like that, because in some sense, your safety net was the inverse of a safety net. It was like it was a spider's web of parasitism and sort of blood-sucking, sort of vampirism. And so, because essentially you were the toy, usually the spider is a kind of borderline. So in some sense, I do think that generally the production of narcissistic children, and you can't generalize it this much because it can be a naturally occurring sort of, children themselves are very much in the driving seat of their own development. But it can often be, let's say, they can, so I mean, almost they can get the idea of the strategy, and if you don't have enough vigilant parentage to kind of to model, let's just say, because in some sense, I think that if you are good at modeling stage 4 or even stage 5 would probably be a bit better. But if you were capable of modeling a healthy enough state, you see, this is the problem, is that in some sense, I think that you get also dirty, you maybe get good enough dirty narcissistic gateway filters by modeling yourself after stage 4. That essentially you can use stage 4 as a role model, but you are going to have a lot of residue that is going to be problematic. But in some sense, there's always going to be toxic residue in connection with the subconscious anyway. But in some sense, it's better to know at least the principle of how the unconscious functions, and you can never distill the principle well enough if you still have, let's say, a kind of a control center in the subconscious that you haven't turned your back on. And in some sense, the hollow self is not capable of turning its back on the subconscious because it is just a kind of mirror reflection. It's a pale imitation of a kind of it's a hook on the end of a fishing line of a narcissistic sort of ingrate or anyway, I don't want to be too insulting, but essentially, I mean, this is why narcissists are described as essentially they are frozen in their development. There are 5-year-olds that froze. There are 6-7-year-olds. A narcissist is someone from between the ages probably of 3 and 9 years old. I don't know what Sam Buckman usually says, the age range that he usually gives. I think he says sort of between 2 and 10 or something like that. Maybe something like that. Now, in some sense, you do have to leave your subconscious behind at some point, but you have to leave your subconscious behind having stolen something from it, and you can't steal something from it if it's never stable enough. So you do have to, I think, develop your subconscious up to such a level that you can steal the fire, that you can, the unconscious side of the mind is very much, I think, in the vogue of, this is embarrassing, I've just blanked on the Greek myth. Who stole fire from the gods? The friend of man. What's his name? Starts with a P. This is so, that ends up with his liver being pecked at by crows. Everyone knows who I'm referring to, but it's embarrassing. I can't remember the name. But so you see, that is the fate of the friend of man in some sense, which is in some sense the, let's say, the Seth project. Now, what's interesting as well is that in some sense, Sattva is themselves, I would argue, the archetype of Seth, whereas Rajas is the archetype of Adam, and Tamas is in some sense the archetype of Cain, because their first step in their metagram circuitry is essentially in tune with. Now this is. So I still don't know exactly how to model this, and I would have to kind of play around and experiment with it and see which one actually seems to be the actual integration between metatype and metagram. So either I would take the normal sequence, which is death, lust, vanity, enticed lust, parent, trial instead of parent, sin. Those are the 6 things, which said in MBTI is death, child function, dominant function, parent function, inferior function, sin. So the death and the sin doesn't actually have doesn't really have a correlation with MBTI, except to say that the death will also be the inferior function of the last side of the mind, and the sin will also be the child function of the preceding side of the mind. But otherwise, the death and the lust have a kind of have a twofold compartmentalization. They have a twofold nature in their selves, and that's what allows for the bookends to have these problems, because between the parent function and between the dominant function, there's a conjoining, or they are on either side of those shared functions. And so there's a tug of war between the parent function over the inferior function and the sin, and the dominant function is having the tug of war on the other side. And in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind is a good receiver, in terms of that its dominant function wants to receive the keys to the car, but the parent function in the subconscious doesn't want to give over control of the inferior function and the sin in some sense. And this is where I think narcissism and narcissistic gateway filters come from, is because the trial and the sin itself, which is repurposed by the next side of the mind as the death and the lust, the parent function has a love-hate relationship to those functions, because they invalidate they both invalidate the side of the mind that the parent function is on, but it also gives the parent function a way to invent a whole new reality. And in some sense, the reality of the unconscious side of the mind is in some sense being tutelaged, is under the pedagogy of the parent function in the subconscious, which is in some sense adopting the role of the false prophet. So in some sense, the rule of the false prophet from the superego is being transferred over to the subconscious. So instead of having a negative world controller behind the scenes, the god of the world, you're trying to have responsibility inside your own subconscious, which is important, because otherwise you'll never open the door to the unconscious side of the mind, and you'll never grow in responsibility and self-determinism. Okay, so once you do that, though, at some point you have to kind of say, well, which is more important, the dominant function in the unconscious or the dominant function in the subconscious? And this is the biggest problem, is that you have to let your subconscious die and be reborn as the unconscious incarnate. You have to kind of let go of the subconscious, but also start again. So it's not just a let go, it's actually like you have to kind of burn the subconscious to the ground and steal the ashes and make a diamond out of the ashes of the subconscious. But you can't do that if the subconscious never developed big enough, because there isn't enough material to burn. So you can't burn something before it's completed. This is somewhat perhaps symbolic of Abraham sacrificing his son because God told him to sacrifice his son on the pyre, and then he changes his mind. So it's like, it's this is the transition, the 2.5 narcissism gateway, is that you have to be capable of sacrificing any belief for the attainment of a higher truth through the next side of the mind. Abraham somewhat exemplifies that. That's why, a lot of these biblical stories are very useful to teach young children, because it gives them, it's like the mystery, it's like the mystery schools. It's like this is what the Egyptian religion was all about, is you have these stories about Osiris and these stories about Horus and these stories. It's a metaphysical representation of the spiritual plane. I mean, otherwise, how do you think you get priests? How would anyone ever become a priest? If you don't have these stories being told to young children because their parents don't understand them, their parents are Kegan stage 3 or maybe Kegan stage 4 at the best, but maybe that child could be a Kegan stage 5, or maybe born to a family of Kegan stage 3 as a child that could very easily be Kegan stage 4. But how are they ever going to navigate it unless their parents, who are only Kegan stage 3, can tell them these stories, because it's the religion, inverted commas, the religion. Anyway, so I mean, in some sense, I'm trying to bring back culture with a capital C. Um, anyway, I'm just trying to say that the Abrahamic story there is, I believe it was Abraham. I'm gonna look like an idiot if maybe it wasn't. Wow, it just shows my memory. Um, anyway, moving on. Uh, so anyway, yeah. So in some sense, so I'm still sound like an idiot and I'm confused that I don't know exactly how to model this. That the either the metatype sequence is canonical, and then it's occluded by the metagram disordered kind of projection onto the metatype order, so that you've got this uneasy conflation of the two happening simultaneously. And then perhaps you have to kind of say, well, in terms of metatype, these are the last two stages of the weak points, which then will also perhaps have a mirrored weak point, because in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind itself can be some of the ingredients that the metagram circuitry is made out of. So this is the problem, is that in some sense metatype is inside of metagram, as metagram sits on top of metatype. And so that's the problem that I'm having in trying to make a model for this, is that it's fundamentally messy, and it's fundamentally unique to that particular metatype and the particular metagrams that metatype is prone, of which I've essentially already worked out all of the. I mean, I know for a fact, according to my model, that there are 48 metagram types. So there are only 48 metagram types. Um, Although there might be 72, because I did cull 24 of them, because I said that essentially that because they might be theoretically possible, but I said that they were not cognitively they were not possible of being sequitur. So I might have to reinvent that part to rescue those 24. But in some sense, I think that those 24 might have to do with like Solomon's magic and the keys of Solomon, and what in Islam is talked of as the jinns, the world of the jinns. In some sense, they might be these irrational gluey bits that exist within karma. In some sense, that they kind of are like irrational. In some sense, they could be like the fairies and stuff like that. The kind of the you know they are like they're like karmic magic in some sense, and you can find ways to kind of tap into them, but it's sort of that's not even close to being close to Kegan stage uh, 5. I don't. If you go that route, then essentially you are destroying your substrate of being able to. Because if you have those kinds of friends within Kegan stage 3, within the unconsciousness, then essentially you won't ever be able to connect with the Kegan stage 4. Damn, I just lost what I was going to say. Essentially, you can't make it through the borderline gateway filter. If you have those the only way that you can make it outside, the only way that you can make it through the borderline gateway filter that connects the unconscious to the ego, that connects Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4, is essentially by some procedure in which you are committed to developing a golden circuit. And if your golden circuit is not golden, and will not be golden because you have made friends of the friends, maybe is too is not the right. In some sense, these are things that will exist in the ether in some sense, and they are what keeps your circuitry on its toes. But you can't sort of make an alliance of them. In some sense, you can't. I'm going to try and make a weird analogy here. That in some sense, if those 24 things left over are something like the angels and demons, which are in some sense maybe part and parcel of the same thing, that the same thing from another angle is a demon, is an angel, or perhaps it's made demonic because of the context and because of the sympathy that it has sort of inclined itself within a particular context. Because in some sense, I'm not talking about an entity, or if it is an entity, it's not the same kind of entity in the realm of converters. Like we are converters that can convert charge from one field circuit to another. These entities actually, they would also be converters potentially. Yeah, because they would have the same. Yeah, they would also be converters. Those 24 metagram converters, they would be interesting. I guess maybe I shouldn't have thrown them away because they might still fit into certain metatypes, and therefore some people might have in the wings of their metatype, or in their metagram circuitry, a closer correspondence to these kinds of. Anyway, I'm talking a lot. Anyway, I don't really. I think it's better to leave them out of. Uh, in some sense, I think I would relegate that to the idea of animal spirits. In some sense, that they're almost like animals. That they're like creatures within the spirits, if you want to analogize them to anything. But they also could just be complete inventions. Because I mean, the other reason why I threw them out. Was because the method that I was using in order to discover the metagram circuitry, which is something that at some point I'll have to recapitulate, was after I had discovered the component parts of metagram, and after I had discovered the component parts of metagram, the emotional tones, it was the discovery that I'm, 'cause, 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 ' and this was by empirical observation, that there were certain strict combinations of sequitur flow between emotional tones. And based on discovering the rudimentary rules of those consecutive flows, I could conceive of all the possible chains. And when I conceived of all the possible chains, I got 72 um, within the number that which I was locked into, because I was essentially locked into a number of 6. Um, but that's also a bit complicated, because it is complicated in metagram, which is why I kind of invented a slightly new spin or a slightly new terminology to describe the 6 stages. Anyway, that when I was doing that, those 6. Let me just find what I was saying. Those. Yeah. So anyway, when I had that unit, you see, there was another bit of information here, which is essentially specifically knowing something about metatype. That there was a particular theory about metatype that I had at the time of that stage of development, which was something to do with a very particular way of understanding. I mean, it must. I can't. I'm not doing this by memory, but by logic, I can sort of recapitulate that it would have something to do with the concept of the false prophet. That essentially, because the false prophet is always having to essentially define itself in terms of the 2 subsequent cognitive functions, that you have only so many combinations of, in some sense, you have to have something. In some sense, you have to conflate 2 cognitive functions, and when you conflate those 2 cognitive functions that are sequential to one another, that they have to be commensurate in a kind of in a false dichotomous sort of way of commensuration, that one is the negative and one is the positive. Of they have to be capable of being read twice and told once. So they have to be commanded once by the false prophet and read twice by the 2 subsequent cognitive functions. And when you kind of take something like a theory like that into already the field of metagram, in terms of the very particular rules of the consecutive procession of how the emotional tones um, of how the emotional tones of how the emotional tones you know, because essentially if you make enough, I mean, even you can go beyond the number of 6, but in some sense you don't need to go beyond the number of 4, because in some sense all the emotional tones, essentially the greatest complexity is a pattern of 4, because they all have a pattern of 4 and then they repeat 2 in the sequence. And I can't tell you which 2 that they repeat, because that depends on which type of converter it is, because there are 3 subspecies of converter, and so they each within that pattern will have a duplication to go from 4 to 6. But in some sense, you can represent, if you remove the understanding that you have actually a base of 6, you can you can depict it as 4 things, but in some sense, to understand it in full regalia or whatever, it unfolds into 6. But anyway, I mean, this is technical bullshit. But so my point here is that what was the point that I was getting to? I was talking about 6 things. Anyway, the real complicated thing oh wait, I think I might have just discovered something about metagram now. Is that because you have that extra 2 from a base set of 4, but it's not really an extra 2, but in some sense it's a duplication of their own metagram circuitry. So in some sense, when metagram circuitry revisits itself as the last 2, that is why the last 2 is toxic. Basically, this is what stops you from having a golden circuit, is because in your metagram circuitry you have 4 distinct component parts, but the last 2 are duplicate and extraneous. And when you tap into the last 2, you are kind of I'm probably using the wrong word, but in some sense, you're getting into an implicit resequencing of your own internal constitution. And metagram circuitry does not like resequencing itself, because that's like self-surgery. That's like, the sculpture having to sculpt itself. There's a wonderful quote about, man can only remake himself because he is both the sculptor and the clay, or something like that. And anyway, so that's the problem with metagram circuitry, is that the unwillingness to burden the last 2 of those extraneous steps in some sense. But the weird thing is because those last 2 steps, depending on the subtype, will be that the trial and the sin of the metagram circuit will also be a resequenced or an out of sequence correspondent of one of the first 4, depending on the subtype. And so in some sense, Sattva probably has a bit of a leg up over everyone else, because in Sattva, the very first metagram component in Sattva is the trial. So in some sense, they get over their resequencing right from the start, because when they do their first sequence, they are already tapping into the future. They are already tapping into their trial. Because they are at the beginning, they are having a first bite at the cherry, and no one has had a bite of the cherry before. So when they take that first bite of the cherry, they are intrinsically seeing the future. They are intrinsically seeing what is already going to happen after the other 2 steps in the metagram sequence. The subsequent, the preceding 3 steps. So their first step gives them a shortcut to the 5th step in their metagram sequencing, but then they still need to go back and go through the other 3 and then revisit the resequence. And then in some sense it kind of keeps those 3 under surveillance. In some sense, their Sattva has a leg up over everyone else, because it in some sense has an internal limitation on their own, on the 3 middle bits, and the 3 middle bits are the most toxic, because they correspond with the child function. Although maybe that might be incorrect to say that in metagram, because it's complicated, but essentially it corresponds to the lust, the vanity, and the enticed lust, which in metatype, those would usually correspond with the child function, the dominant function, and the parent function. So Sattva already invalidates implicitly, just by its structure, it invalidates the lust of their unconscious, the vanity of their unconscious, and the enticed lust of their unconscious. So they are already using, in their unconscious side of the mind, their dominant function, their child function, their dominant function, and their parent function in a very suspect, or when I say suspect, they are already conscientious about using those functions in a very conservative way, because they already know that they have to have a starting position that is resequenced, that kind of takes all of that into account, or something like that. So they've got a leash over the Cerberus, the 3-headed, sort of hellhound is already on their leash in some sense, but that doesn't mean that they can't let go of the leash and make friends with the demonic beast or whatever. In some sense, Sattva people, if they lean into borderline, are it's impossible to get them back on the leash, as it were, or because the kind of, they know that they have been so unethical that for them to rein themselves in, they it's they're too fearful of the lack of forgiveness or something like that, because you would need to have like a Kegan stage 5 culture that would be capable of sort of forgiving them, perhaps, or something like that. So there's a lot of fear about owning sattva, owning its own lapse in its moral unconscious sort of its karmic sort of and this is the problem, is that karma itself, I mean, I don't want to talk too fast and loose here and sort of degrade everything down into, well, it doesn't matter because it's all mud anyway, because it's not that sort of thing. You do need to have a golden circuit, and that's a problem if you feel like, well, actually it's impossible to have a golden circuit now because someone will always, because there's a lingering remnant of something that someone didn't take the right way. And in some sense that is something of the fear that there isn't justice within your culture, there isn't justice within your society, that you can't expect to have it hashed out because someone might just be a vigilante and come and be a revolutionary against you or something like that. So it's this kind of this antitrust, a kind of an antitrust idolatry as well, perhaps. Uh, and in some sense, it has to do also with a kind of projective denigration that other people need to be forgiven, even if they don't deserve it, or even if they haven't asked to be forgiven. They must just be bestowed a high status, and then there's a kind of so that there is an automatic sort of indulgence and, let's say, sort of superficial covering of everyone's misdeeds, rather than actually bringing about a true reconciliation under some kind of systematized um, construct of attaining to a single faith. That the secrets are really what need to kind of, at least the pertinent and salient secrets. But in some sense, I mean, I don't disparage people that have secrets and that keep secrets, because we don't have justice, we don't have psychology in a good enough state that we can expect not to be maltreated in some sense, because in some sense we rightly don't have confidence in the false authority of the world, in the principalities of the air, in the four winds, which are these four field circuits, these four principalities of the air in the realm of the intelligible, which you might get whisked off down some inquisitorial line because they're not willing to listen to your ability to convert charge from one field to another field, because you want to have it balanced all out in some sense. And in some sense, again, I mean, in some sense, this is a reflection of the problem which is inherited by the ego, which is only resolved when the ego actually does take 100% responsibility upon themselves, even though sin is an emergent, because you can always say, well, yes, I did the wrong thing, but it was because somebody else did this first, a reaction, problem solution. Yeah, my solution is also a problem, but it's a solution to a problem. And when does that end and when does that begin? In some sense, you have to bootstrap that down to a principle. And in some sense, you need a principle that's capable of forgiving itself also. But that is justified when doing so. And in some sense, I mean, in some sense, this is not where the healing takes place. The healing takes place in relation to the subconscious, between the superego and the subconscious. But anyway, um, because that is where the real charge is in some sense. Because in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind is a bit of a, although the petition is correctly sort of aimed there, in some sense there is this idea that the unconscious side of the mind is in a static way, I think, properly represented as a pool of water, and any motion in the pool of water is going to create waves, and those waves are going to coalesce perhaps and have feedback with other waves that are already in the pool, and perhaps you didn't see the waves that were going to be part of an interference pattern, because the interference pattern in some sense only started to emerge at the same time that both entities um, independently started sort of creating their wave in the pool. And so there is this, like, let's say, it's this impossibility of preventing mistake, but we do have a possibility of being golden enough in our circuitry to not be prone to error. Error and mistake is not the same. Anyway, um, and in some sense, what I'm saying in that sense is that a mistake can often be attributed correctly to the property of a post hoc revelation of a in the same way that information can be legitimately veiled, secrets can be legitimately held in the unconscious space of interpersonal, anyway, uh, negotiation, exchange, and whatever through the field circuits. But anyway, we, in some sense, I think that this is all like in some sense, this is perhaps, yeah, I do need to, okay, well, anyway, so I was talking mainly about trying to model the unconscious side of the mind, but now I feel like I'm about to make comments, and I maybe will go into indulging in some comments about understanding, calling the unconscious side of the mind the first side of the mind now after the repartition of self-actualization or the liberation, that is, in my system, I would say, I would still describe it as precipitated by Christ consciousness. Um, that what you are doing is what you are doing is so what I'm trying to get toward describing is how to redefine the ego then when you are starting from the position of being in this pool. In some sense, the ego has almost like, I mean, I always, whenever I try to describe the ego, I use this metaphor that imagine waking up in a captain's ship and you have the captain's hat of a ship, and you're wearing the clothes, but you don't have a memory. You wake up with absolutely no memory, and maybe you can just use language, but you don't know anything about anyone or anything. And in some way, you are guided by these other people who are deferring to you and are willing to sort of take direction from you, and are somewhat even saying things that direct you towards your station. And you walk up to this wheel, and you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you're turning the wheel, and then you notice that the ship goes one way, and you turn the wheel, and you notice the ship goes another way, and the wind is hitting the sails, and people seem to be asking you to bark out commands at them so that things can happen or something like that. And how much do you know about how many signals are being bandied about in terms of communicating what's going on? And how much can you kind of recapitulate what's going on just from what seems to be going on in the pool of unconsciousness, in some sense, just what's going on in the field of sort of the present time, in terms of everything that seems to be in motion and everything that seems to be being practiced at the time. That you're looking at the world, you're capable of looking at the world through new eyes and sort of postulating everything from the ground up, and understanding everything from essentially just being given a participation and a participatory role, and then you have to kind of backtrack and also evaluate or create your own values. I'm kind of, I guess, connotating the sort of the Übermensch sort of thing. Like, how many people would have the confidence that it would take them 3 days to wake up and to kind of by just clear, what was the Cartesian sort of clear distinct perceptions, building upon clear distinct perceptions to build a model of their functional role. And I mean, obviously, it might be helped along if someone said, "Oh, Captain, you're looking ill. Like, do you want me to take over?" If you have a second in command that's willing to kind of say that, then that can perhaps give you the breadth to get your bearing, and then you can also watch the second in command play the role and bark the orders, and then you very clearly start mapping out, exactly how you might fake it until you make it, or something like that. But this fake it until you make it is not Kegan stage 5. This fake it until you make it is Kegan stage 4, just to be very clear. But that is essentially, I think, how the ego functions, that it's an actualized role, that you are learning how to draw boundaries and distinctions and realms of sort of responsibility and self-determinism, so that you are not overly bogged down in the sort of in the law of the conservation of interference from the karmic unconscious or something like that, in which you don't know in what page of the story that you even start operating on, in some sense, because anyway. Okay, this is a weird sort of example to get into, but in some sense that means that your ego becomes like a child, I would say, at least in vogue, in line with my metaphor of waking up and starting from scratch. But then the real treasure, I think, is the reformulated superego, which now is becoming full circle, which is becoming really the place where the real treasure is, the New Jerusalem. And in some sense, that is where all your experience and all your toxic travail or whatever, because in some sense, when you do the repartitioning, your subconscious is being perfected now properly by, in some sense, by being grounded in the unconscious, in the principia, in the first place of principle. So you are grounding your superego in your principles, and then your superego is being able to manage your subconscious as a kind of neo ego, in some sense, what was the ego is now the subconscious. The sub, I mean, because that's what the repartition is in some sense. So if you understand that the lesser of the lesser, the greater of the lesser, the lesser of the greater, and the greater of the greater was in the first time around of the development of the false ego complex, was in that order: the subconscious. Sorry, I misspoke. The first thing is the superego, the second thing is the subconscious, the third thing is the unconscious, and the fourth thing is the ego. After the repartition, the lesser of the greater, which was the unconscious, that becomes like the lesser of the lesser. And the ego, the greater of the greater, becomes like the greater of the lesser, becomes like the second thing. And then the superego becomes like the third thing in the first sequence, becomes like the new unconscious. This is too confusing to probably follow in voice, but and then the fourth thing is the subconscious. So the subconscious gets sort of becomes, so the lesser of the lesser in the first sequence becomes like the greater of the greater, and in some sense that could probably also correspond in Kabbalah with the concept of Malkuth, which is often symbolized that there's anyway that there's a kind of there's an important sort of transmutation that happens between Yesod and Malkuth. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But Yesod is often archetypally referenced as the moon, which reflects the sun. When there's something about the moon, I must say this is why I've always chosen the name Zangetsu, because Zangetsu, it has many different meanings, but it is connected with the moon. Um, or I mean, it has a Chinese meaning and it has a Japanese meaning. It's actually in both. But anyway, really, the archetype of Zangetsu that I've always liked the most, it doesn't come from Bleach. In fact, it comes from an older anime that I was part of writing, and I directed the one of the English dubs. Not there were two English dubs, and I directed one of them, the one that sounds more childish. I must say I really like that English dub. I think I still always tell people when they watch the Giant Robo OVA, the 7 episode Giant Robo OVA with the English dub, I always try to make sure that they watch the correct English dub. Um, that it has he's actually one of the bad guys, but Zangetsu the Midday, he's called Zangetsu the Midday. He's sort of in the Illuminati. Um, it's a very interesting anime. I would really recommend it for people to watch. It's called Giant Robo and the Day That the Earth Stood Still, which was something of a true story. I mean, there are a lot of autobiographical elements in that. In some sense, I'm very much like the main character of the show, the boy that commands Giant Robo or anything like that. It's a bit of a strange thing to say about oneself. But it's a very interesting anime to watch. It's only 7 episodes. Anyway, there's a beautiful synthesis of art and history and themes of justice and the complexity of the plot itself is quite grand. I just hope that people watch the correct English dub. It's the one that's actually more emotional. It's the one that's more expressive. The one that's more monotone. It's not that one. It's the one that's kind of much more. It almost sounds slightly more juvenile, but it's much more direct in the grammar of what's being communicated. Um, anyway, perhaps I've sort of said too much, but anyway, I mean, Zangetsu has been a recurring motif in many sort of things. Zangetsu in Bleach, the spirit of the sword, which is very much the archetype of the moon in Bleach, but Bleach really went off the rails. Anyway, I don't want to really talk about it going off the rails, but Let me just think if there's another good archetype of Zangetsu. This is a bit too weak, but Itachi in Naruto, his Susanoo has a legendary sword. Uh, I can't even say the Japanese word. It's something like, but anyway, and it has, and his Susanoo also has a shield, and between that sword and that shield, it's pretty much, anyway. But I mean, in some sense, that's very weirdly symbolic, and you can't actually read too deeply into that particular facet of Itachi, except you wonder where did he get that from? That's a bit strange. Uh, but yeah, Itachi was probably the most autobiographical character that I was ever a part of designing the plot for, um, in terms of my actual life, but in terms of at least the metaphysics of it. Also, Full Metal Alchemist is very autobiographical, but more in terms of the themes of my work itself, of the actual alchemy. But and all these things have so many personal things littered within them. It makes me so emotional thinking about it. It makes me so emotional that I hope I'm just a crackpot. Uh, anyway, but it is slightly annoying that I haven't completely worked out this integration between metagram and metatype. But I think that the permutations are, sadly, it will be messy and complicated. Might not have a. I mean, in some sense, I'll probably just find a mechanical way of pointing out all the interesting points of intersection and all the interesting points of internal impingement. The problem is that if you follow those points of you can make an endless chain. If you look into that too deeply, I mean, in some sense, the only point of looking into that is to understand certain psychopathologies. That would give you an understanding of what I've already called as sort of Kegan stage 4.5, which I believe is actually being trapped in Kegan stage 3, but between the two gateway filters, so much so that it looks like that you're in Kegan stage 4, because you've actually found a way within Kegan stage 3 to kind of puppet some ego functions. You're actually reaching from within Kegan stage 4. There's a tentacle that's coming out of the borderline gateway, and it's controlling the ego. That is how I see Kegan stage 4.5. You're not in Kegan stage 4, you're in Kegan stage 3, but there's a tentacle coming from Kegan stage 3, that is connected to this mirror trick, that you've got these two mirrors within Kegan stage, between Kegan stage 2.5 and between 3.5, the two gateways are giving you this room in order to grow this monster that then can kind of even reach out of itself and manipulate. And in some sense, it does this by anchoring itself also in Kegan stage 2. But in some sense, that's a kind of that's a virtual projection in some sense, because it is inculcated within the unconscious. So in some sense, it's kind of like you are the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain in your subconscious, and then what you are representing to other people as Kegan stage 3 is the Wizard of Oz with the mist and the smoke and the hologram and the loud noises, and then from that you are controlling other people's lives by sort of is projecting its power out into Kegan stage 4. And so you kind of think that you've got a mastery of these things, because you are in some sense existing over three sides of the mind. Your power is conjoined between the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego, and that is not a stable Kegan stage 4 even. I would call that a kind of, well, I would call it a 4.5, but I've just defined 4.5 as somewhat being actually more situated in trying to create some kind of elaborate device that is something like the Wizard of Oz, sort of conjuring machine of hologram and smoke and loud noises. But also the issue here is that this partition between the subconscious and the unconscious is such an important part of development. In some sense, even if you are in Kegan stage 3, you need to see that as a proximate goal, how to partition away from your subconscious, how to steal the fire of your subconscious and plant it into the earth of the unconscious, and get your unconscious to grow up as an independent sort of, to give the footing of your ego an independent sort of frame of reference, which would be something like growing up and putting away childish things. And those childish things are this idea that your beliefs can be right or wrong, instead of the fact that but even that is too much of a simplistic, that doesn't resolve it. It's more complicated than, your beliefs aren't right or wrong. Something like the belief and the context together are the principle of the matter, and the principle must be right. That's something of the way to grow up into your unconscious properly, to make that the first place, to make that the principia, the grounding principle. Anyway, I'm going around in circles, repeating myself. I mean, people might say that perhaps I've taken my liberty of sort of littering the world and the culture with all these things that pertain to my work, unless they think that I'm a complete lunatic and a crackpot, which in some sense maybe that'll keep me safe at least. But, in doing these things, I mean, I don't see, well, I mean, first of all, I didn't see any other way to kind of end history. Um, and because in some sense, I am sick of these secret things. I'm sick of these secrets, these necessary secrets. I'm sick of them. The times that we have had to do things, and the world does not even have an understanding of its own history, because it doesn't know the real history of the world. It doesn't know what the problems are in leadership. It doesn't know. I mean, we have been attacked by forces that no one knows about. Many, many times, or not. Well, I mean, still many times as well. I mean, the necessity of black book operations. I mean, if we didn't have black book operations, we wouldn't be alive. None of us would be alive. The species would have been over a long time ago. I mean, this is part of the trouble of leadership in some sense. I mean, this is, we live in a there are greater things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. And it would be nice if we could start being a bit more open, but you can't just force this, because otherwise you get a pasteurized culture. We need to preserve what makes us special. We can't lose ourselves into the sea of the stars. We can't lose ourselves to a stupid narrative. I mean, that's exactly the position that we were in before the Great Flood, I believe. That was the wickedness of men, is that they were too clever for their own good. They didn't understand, but they knew the story. They knew the narrative. You see, this is the thing, is you can't, knowing the truth as a factoid, as a subconscious, is not good enough. You have to understand it. And the only way to understand it is to, like I said, you have to wake up and not know who you are, and actually develop the understanding yourself, and grow in your own. Anyway, so I mean, it's a bit of a cheat if I say, all of these things I think are actually, I mean, well, the climate is changing, but it's got nothing to do with carbon, I would say. I really think it has nothing to do with carbon. Um, but anyway, but the climate is going to be probably changing. But I mean, that's because we're leaving the little ice age. but and we do need to worry about pollution. Pollution is a very serious thing that we need to worry about and do something about. But it's not, I don't know. Global warming, I think, is a complete concoction. But anyway, I mean, I say this. I mean, in some sense, we have no idea how the weather works. Um, blah blah blah. But a lot of this is really a kind of there's this wonderful song by AWOL Nation, "Wake Up," and in some sense, well, anyway, it's been scrawled on many things in many generations. Know thyself, and you will know the gods in the universe. And we still need to do that. That's still number one on the list. But well, it's low on the list to some people. So I don't know, and that's the problem. Is it kind of needs to be on top of the list to ground oneself within your own justified understanding. Anyway, that's my clarion call, if that's the right phrase. I'm so uneducated.